Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. The narrative I'm about to tell has traveled over mountains, silences, and entire generations without ever being fully comprehended. Tell me where you're viewing from now on. The year was 1834. West Virginia was not yet a distinct state. It was just Virginia's western region, a region of massive mountains encased in thick forests with little light from the sun. The Appalachian Mountains towered over the landscape like venerable protectors of secrets they wanted to stay buried. In the past, the area was inhabited by remote people and small groups that lived days apart and were only connected by treacherous, narrow paths that meandered through the deep valleys. One of those areas where time seemed to flow differently was Greenbrier County. In the clearings they could make in the impassable forest, they raised pigs and grew corn as a means of subsistence. Although difficult, life was predictable. Even if they lived miles away, families knew their neighbors. Separate. Everyone was aware of their identities, origins, and the stories they held. It was a community bound together by unseen ties of mutual need and trust. Because you had to rely on one another to get through the severe winters in the mountains, which turned the area into a lethal white desert. The Hadley family established their lives in this environment. When the events started, Isaiah Hadley, the patriarch, was 42. His broad shoulders and lofty stature were the result of decades of arduous work. Martha, his 38-year-old wife, was well known for her. She was respected and somewhat feared by her neighbors for her proficiency with therapeutic herbs. Jacob, the oldest of their 7 children, was 19 years old. Rebecca, who was 17, Thomas, who was 15, Mary, who was 13, Samuel, who was 11, Elizabeth, who was 9, and little Hannah, who was only 5, were the next in line. The Hadley homestead was located in the Sinking Creek Valley, where the stream inexplicably vanished into subterranean caverns before reappearing miles distant. Isaiah and Jacob had chopped and hauled down the massive logs that made up the dark wood home. Mountain. The fact that it was 2 floors high, unusual for the area, indicated that the Hadleys had attained a certain level of success. They kept tools, seeds, and winter supplies in a barn at the back of the property. Everything was swallowed up by the trees beyond. The Cooper family, who resided along the trail some 2 miles north, were their nearest neighbors. There was nobody for 10 or 12 miles after them. The Hadleys were unaffected by their seclusion. They were independent, industrious, and pious. Each Sunday, regardless of the weather. With permission, they walked the distance to the little wooden church that catered to the whole valley. There, they gathered with other families, shared news, and expressed worries about the harvest, the wild animals that occasionally attacked their livestock, and the reports that the more isolated areas of the mountains were still home to native tribes. However, something shifted in late October of that year. Autumn has come with a strange chill. Unexpectedly, the leaves dropped, and a lingering fog started to emerge from the valley every morning, dissipating until midday. People talked about the unusual weather, the restless woodland animals, and the crows' constant cawing as they circled over Sinking Creek. Samuel Cooper, the eldest son of the nearby family, passed the Hadley property on his way to Lewisburg for supplies on one of those chilly mornings, October 28th. When he noticed Isaiah working in the fields, he waved, and Isaiah returned the wave. Everything appeared to be typical. Martha was watching the kids playing in the porch. Yard. Samuel carried on, intending to take the same route back the following day. Something had changed on the evening of the 29th when he returned. It was unusually quiet on the Hadley estate. The nights were already chilly, therefore it was odd that there was no smoke rising from the chimney. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather made Samuel slow down. No one responded when he called out. In their pen, the pigs were agitated and making hungry grunts. The hens were freely scratching in the yard, something Martha would never consent to. After getting off his horse, Samuel made his way to the home. The entrance door swung gently in the wind like a jar. Calling for the Hadleys, he pushed it open and went inside. The interior was a mess. There were shattered plates on the kitchen floor, overturned chairs, and an upturned pot next to the unlit stove. However, none of the 7 children, Isaiah or Martha, were present. Samuel dashed from one room to another. Clothes were scattered and beds were not made, but no, symbol of the family. He called their names until his voice was heard, ran outside, and checked the barn at the back of the property. Nothing. Between the morning of the 28th and the evening of the 29th, 9 people seemed to have just disappeared. Samuel, terrified, got on his horse and rode for home. He roused his father and 3 other men from the neighborhood. That evening, they picked up flashlights and went back to the Hadley farm to look for anything that might provide an explanation. They were even more troubled by what they discovered. The men. Until the wee hours of the morning, the Hadley property was searched. Their headlights flickered, revealing features that Samuel had overlooked in his initial hurry. The hardwood floor near the fireplace in the main room has brown stains on it. They were still visible in the sunlight, though they seemed as if they had been cleaned in a hurry. Everyone believed the same thing, but nobody wanted to publicly state what they might be. The beds in Rebecca and Mary's room were pulled apart. The linens had been torn off, and feathers were strewn all over the floor from one of the cushions. The leftover stew, which was starting to go bad, was in the kitchen in the overturned pot. It was obvious that Martha was making dinner when the incident occurred. Her vegetable chopping knife was on the ground, its blade clean, but its placement indicated it had been dropped with force. Samuel's father, Thomas Cooper, was a pragmatic man who had spent 56 years living in those mountains. Bears had attacked cabins he had witnessed, assisted in the search for missing kids in the forest, and saw tragic altercations amongst neighbors. However, this was unlike anything I had ever seen. A whole family vanished, leaving no obvious evidence of their whereabouts or what transpired. They looked for evidence of forced entry on the windows and doors. Nothing. The position of the hinges and latch made it clear that the front door had been opened from the inside. That door had been opened by one of the family members, either to let someone in or to escape. None of the windows were smashed or damaged. Compelled, as it should be, the barn was also secured from the outside. On October 30th, additional men showed up as the sun rose. With the remarkable quickness that tragedies have in tiny towns, word had already started to circulate throughout the mountains. 15 men, some with horses and others who had walked from far-off lands, assembled in the backyard of the Hadleys. They divided into groups and started exploring the neighborhood, circling the house in ever-widening circles. The initial group pursued the path that led to the property owned by Cooper. They examined every square inch of the path, searching for any indication that someone had hurried past, such as footprints or ripped clothing and bushes. All they discovered were Samuel's horse's shoe marks from the day before. The second group made their way down to Sinking Creek. At that time of year, the water was low, and if someone had just passed by, their footprints would have been on the muddy banks. They strolled for over a mile on either side of the creek, looking into thee, calling the Hadleys' names until their voices reverberated off the granite formations, were the little caverns scattered over the slopes. The hush that followed was deafening. Behind the property, the third party ventured into the thick woodland. The area was hazardous, with cliffs and secret ravines that appeared out of nowhere amongst the trees. They were mindful of every sound and every movement as they proceeded carefully. Joshua Miller, one of the men, discovered something that caused everyone to halt. The fabric was blue, just like Martha used to use it. Roughly 300 meters into the forest, affixed on a prickly branch for her garments. The cloth was ripped with sharp edges, as though someone had sprinted through the thorns. They kept going in that way, looking for further evidence, thrilled by the discovery. They discovered a second, smaller, blue piece of fabric 50 meters ahead. Then one more and one more. It felt like someone was being pulled through the undergrowth or was leaving a trail. The men accelerated, their hearts racing. With the hopes of finding Martha and any surviving Hadley family members. They followed the trail of cloth to a narrow opening that let in some sunshine. During lengthy hunts, the nice people occasionally utilized the enormous flat stone in the middle of the clearing as a temporary table. 7 little things were neatly lined up on the stone. Slowly approaching, the men were nearly terrified to verify what they had seen. They were dolls. The gentle mountain kids played with 7 straw and cloth dolls. Every one was. A range of sizes, from biggest to smallest, all arranged with unsettling accuracy. A piece of the blue cloth they had discovered in the branches was worn by the biggest doll. The others were dressed in leftovers that the men identified as Hadley kids' clothes. Hannah was constantly dressed in a faded green dress. A tattered green fabric was wrapped around the tiniest doll. Joshua Miller took up one of the dolls with a shaking hand. It appeared to have been placed there lately, possibly overnight, because it was damp. Upon turning it, he noticed that something had been stitched onto the back. Black thread was used to write it in an uneven line. They observed. The messages from the other dolls were similar. They are aware. They said they had to keep quiet. Carrying the dolls, the party dashed back to the property. Everyone became silent when they presented them to the other men. Wild animals did not create this. It was no coincidence. The Hadley family had been abducted, and the macabre message had been left for them to discover. However, who and why? Above all, where were the 7 children, Isaiah and Martha, now? They were determined to require more skilled assistance. The closest town with established officials was Lewisburg, so 2 guys mounted their fastest horses and rode forth. Each way, the travel would take at least 5 hours. The other men, meanwhile, kept looking, but they were beginning to worry that they may be looking for something much worse rather than survivors. On October 30th, the news arrived in Lewisburg late in the afternoon, resulting in an instant disturbance. William Thornton, the 61-year-old sheriff of Greenbrier County, had fought against the British during the War of 1812. He had witnessed fighting. He had witnessed death. However, he was clearly shaken by the tale the 2 horsemen told. That evening, he gathered 6 men, including Dr. Elias Peton, the town doctor, and headed toward the sinking creek valley with torches to illuminate the perilous route. Just after midnight, they reached the Hadley estate. Despite the darkness, dozens of men continued to hover around the house. Others couldn't go without knowing what had happened to their neighbors, so they stood guard. With the attention to detail of someone skilled at reconstructing violent incidents, Sheriff Thornton entered the house and looked through every room. Dr. Peton was with him, holding a torch in one hand and his medical bag in the other. The doctor's eye was immediately drawn to the dark stains on the main room floor. He dropped to his knees, removed a tiny glass vial from his case, and scraped off a bit of the discolored wood. He inspected it closely, holding it up to the light of his flashlight. His expression grew gloomy. He was certain that was human blood. Not much, maybe the size of a deep cut or a head wound, but there was unmistakably blood, and it had been purposefully rubbed in, most likely with a cloth that had since been removed. Thornton discovered something in the girl's chamber that the local guys had misplaced during the previous night's darkness. Beneath Rebecca's bed, partially concealed by the skirt of floor-length linen, was a little book. It was the diary of Rebecca. Girls from somewhat wealthier homes occasionally kept diaries in which they recorded their daily activities, prayers, and thoughts. Thornton picked up the book with care and turned to the final page. In Rebecca's meticulous handwriting, the entry was dated October 28th. The first few sentences discussed commonplace, unimportant topics like the cold weather, how she had assisted her mother in baking bread that morning, and how Thomas had complained of back discomfort after hauling firewood. However, the final few words were distinct. The words almost ran off the page as the penmanship became more frantic. Since returning from the woods yesterday, Dad has been acting strangely. He refuses to speak. All he does is gaze at the mountains. Despite her worries, Mother remains silent. Last night, Jacob heard odd noises coming from the barn. He claimed that it sounded like someone was crying, but when we went to investigate, nobody was present, I'm afraid. To the men in attendance, Thornton read the sentence out loud. A sigh of discomfort ran throughout the group. 2 days prior to his disappearance, had Isaiah entered the woods? Why? Jacob heard some noises, but what were they? The sheriff gave 2 men instructions to proceed to the barn with spotlights and conduct a more comprehensive search. They had already glanced, but just briefly. The barn was a strong building with considerable hay storage on the roof and thick board walls. The fragrance of old tools, leather, and grain that had been kept was familiar. The men started searching every nook and corner, pushing aside seed bags, and the walls are adorned with hanging tools. At that moment, Albert Green, one of them, walked on a floorboard that made a hollow sound as it gave slightly beneath his weight. He stooped to take a closer look at the board. In contrast to the others, it was not nailed down. It was only jammed into position as though it had just been taken out and put back in. Albert summoned his friend, and the 2 of them raised the board. There was an empty area beneath it, like a compartment hollowed out of the compacted dirt. Additionally, inside this container, both men instantly shied away from objects that were illuminated by the flashing light of their flashlights. Small bones were present, some of which still had tissue bits attached. A dark, leather-bound book with yellowed pages and cramped writing that neither man could read at first sight was also present. There was also something more unsettling, a tooth necklace. It appears to be 23 human teeth strung on a leather cord. Everything was brought inside by the men and set up in the kitchen. Table. As Dr. Peaton studied the book, Sheriff Thornton inspected the bones. The English used on the first few pages was outdated and hard to read. They seemed to be ointment recipes, tea recipes, and comments on medicinal plants. However, the content evolved as the pages went by. Odd patterns started to show up, with circles inside circles and symbols that resembled a combination of letters and numbers. Peaton discovered a date on one of the middle pages. 38 years prior, in 1796, he turned to Thornton and gave him a name, Sarah Blackwood. You are familiar with that name? Is there anyone in the area? The sheriff scowled as he considered. His eyes then grew wide. Blackwood, Sarah. She was hanged in 1797 on witchcraft charges, my God. One of Virginia's final executions of this type. Even though I was only a boy, I can still recall the tale. They said that she had formed sinister agreements and killed a number of children in a nearby community. With that realization weighing them down like a chilly mountain mist, the men exchanged glances. For what reason did Isaiah Hadley possess a book that was owned by a woman who was put to death for practicing witchcraft? From where did the bones originate? What about that tooth necklace? The number of questions increased, but the answers appeared to vanish. Thornton determined that they had to investigate the doll's discovery location in the middle of the day. Interviewing everyone who interacted with the Hadley family in the weeks preceding their disappearance was also necessary. Something must have been heard or seen by someone. families don't just disappear into the mountains without leaving at least a hint of proof. One of the men who had been watching the property overnight hurried into the house, his face white, as the sheriff was planning the next steps of the inquiry. "There's something you need to see," he stated in a tremulous voice. Now they all followed the man outdoors, through the yard to the forest's edge, where someone had etched deep, sharp-edged characters into the bark of a thick oak tree about 50 yards from the house. The pact is renewed. The sun was starting to rise over the Appalachian Mountains, tinting the sky red and orange, but that natural beauty seemed obscene beside the somber message carved into the oak. The tree's sap had run through the marks like dark tears, and the words read, "The blood of the mountain claims what is its own." Sheriff Thornton knew this was no longer a simple search for missing persons, but rather something much darker. Sheriff Thornton ordered the message on the tree to be copied word for word into his official records because he knew it would be essential to understanding what had happened to the Hadleys. As the sun slowly rose over the valley, illuminating the mist that still clung to the hollows of the ground, he gathered his men and started asking methodical questions because he was afraid that before he found answers, he would uncover horrors he wished he had never known. The first person to be formally questioned was Thomas Cooper, the closest neighbor, who sat nervously in a chair on the Hadleys' porch, twisting his hat in his hands. Cooper explained that Isaiah Hadley was a reserved man, but that over the last 3 or 4 weeks he had become even more quiet, as if he were carrying a burden. When we met at church in early October, I attempted to talk to him about it. To him about the harvest and the impending winter. He hardly looked me in the eye. He continued to gaze at the mountains as if expecting to see something emerge from there. Thornton took meticulous notes. And Martha, the kids, did they show any indications that something was wrong? Cooper pondered for a moment. Martha appeared frightened. She didn't say anything out loud, but a woman's fear is evident. The kids were quieter than usual. Jacob, the oldest, had grown too serious for a 19-year-old. Other men were questioned, and Joshua Miller, who had discovered the dolls in the clearing, revealed something intriguing. 10 days prior to the disappearance, he had seen Isaiah walking along the trail that led to the higher parts of the mountains, carrying a large backpack. This was unusual, because the trail led nowhere useful, only to rocky peaks and dense forests. I didn't imagine it was anything like this, that even seasoned hunters shied away from them. When Miller asked Isaiah where he was going, he simply said, "To settle old business," and walked away without turning around. Meanwhile, Dr. Peaton kept poring over Sarah Blackwood's book, sitting at the kitchen table and carefully turning the pages, trying to make sense of the increasingly disorganized writing that filled the spaces. On one of the last pages, he discovered something that stopped him. A list of names, 17 in all, written in ink that. Peaton called Thornton right away, saying, "Look at this. Isaiah was in this book. His name was written this year." The other names were unfamiliar, with the exception of 2 or 3 that he vaguely recognized as belonging to people who had lived in the area decades ago, people who, now that he thought about it, had died or disappeared under strange circumstances. The dates beside each name had faded to a dark brown with age. The first name was Elizabeth Warren, 1793. The last was Isaiah Hadley, 1834. Thornton stated, "We need to find out who these people were, and we need to understand what this list means. If Isaiah was listed here, he was involved in something that started long before 1834 and has been creeping through these mountains for at least 40 years. It was decided that one group would go to Lewisburg to look for records of these people in the county archives. Another group would continue searching the woods along the path Isaiah had taken 10 days prior, and a third group would. The group that entered the forest after the high trail was made up of 6 men, all of whom were experienced hunters who knew these mountains. They carried ropes, machetes, 2 days' worth of provisions, and loaded weapons. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt they might find more than just clues to the Hadleys' whereabouts. They might find the Hadleys themselves, and no one expected this encounter to be pleasant. Interview families farther away to find out if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual in the last few weeks. After 4 hours of strenuous walking, they arrived at a rocky plateau where the vegetation thinned and graystone formations rose from the ground like the bones of some buried people. The forest was different from the one near the Hadley property. It was older, darker, and quieter. The birds didn't sing, and squirrels didn't scamper through the branches. It seemed as though the animals themselves avoided this area. The trail climbed steeply, zigzagging between ancient trees whose trunks were so thick that 3 men couldn't hug them. Giant. In the middle of the plateau was a structure that caused the men to stop abruptly. It was a circle of stones, each about 1 meter high, arranged with mathematical precision. The ground inside the circle was blackened, as if many fires had been lit there over the years. They approached cautiously. The ground inside the circle was not just charred, but covered in layers of ash that must have accumulated decades ago. Upon closer inspection, they found bone fragments among the ash. One of the men, a hunter named Silas Wright, pointed to the opposite side of the plateau and said, "Look over there." There was an opening in the rocky face of the mountain, a cave that was invisible from a distance because it was partially hidden by thorn bushes. The men looked at each other. None of them wanted to go inside, but they all knew they had to, so they lit makeshift torches from branches covered in resin and went inside. It was deeper than they had anticipated. The ceiling slowly lowered, requiring them to bend and then crawl. The air became colder and more humid with each meter, and after roughly 20 meters, the cave opened up once more into a natural chamber, where they would be haunted for the rest of their lives by what they saw. The paintings on the cave walls, illuminated by the torch, were not ancient paintings created by native tribes, but rather recent works created with what appeared to be charcoal and possibly blood. They depicted human figures always in groups of 9. Constantly encircled by recurring symbols, the chamber's floor was lined with 9 mounds of stones, each roughly the size of a human body. The men's hands were shaking as they removed the stones from the first hill, and they didn't have to dig very far before discovering cloth and then bones, the remains of someone who had been buried there years earlier, perhaps, and the cloth had nearly completely decomposed, but it was still evident that it had once belonged to a woman. Dress. A rusty silver medallion was attached to the bones, and when they opened it, they discovered a lock of brown hair and the inscription, Elizabeth Warren. 1787. Elizabeth Warren was the first name on the list in Sarah Blackwood's book. The men exchanged horrified looks as they realized that if this was Elizabeth Warren's grave, then the other 8 mounds probably held the bodies of the other people on the list. But that meant Isaiah Hadley was aware of this location. He had visited, and now his name was on the list too. The men carefully marked the location of the cave, making notches in the trees on the way back, and descended the mountain in heavy silence, not daring to open the other 8 mounds on that first visit, because the weight of what they had found was too great. When they arrived at the Hadley property at dusk, they found Sheriff Thornton waiting with equally unsettling news. The group that had traveled to Lewisburg had returned with records from the county archives. 13 of the 17 names in Sarah Blackwood's book were found to have disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances over the previous 40 years. Jonathan Pierce died in 1798 in a fire that consumed his remote cabin. Authorities at the time thought it odd that an experienced man like Pierce would be trapped in the flames, but they dismissed the case as an accident. Elizabeth Warren vanished in 1793, leaving behind a husband and 2 small children, and she was never found. Sullivan vanished in 1802 while traveling less than a mile between her property and her neighbors. She simply never made it to her destination. And so the list continued, with a series of tragedies occurring over the years, all involving residents of the most remote parts of the mountains, and all lacking a satisfactory explanation. The pattern only became clear when you laid them side by side, as Sheriff Thornton was doing now, spreading documents across his desk. "Look at this," Thornton said, pointing to the dates. "Each case is separated by a space. They are not arbitrary. 5 years from Elizabeth Warren in 1893 to Jonathan Pierce in 1998. 4 years from Pierce to Mary Sullivan in 1802. After that, the intervals become erratic, but they never fall below 2 years or rise above 7. It seems like someone is waiting for the ideal time, following a calendar." Dr. Peyton, who had stayed at the estate to read Sarah Blackwood's book, raised his head. "I discovered something that could help explain this. In the main pages, there are allusions to particular lunar cycles and star alignments throughout this work. Certain rites could only be carried out when the celestial conditions were appropriate, according to Sarah Blackwood, or at least what she wrote. She also brought up what she referred to as the blood covenant of the mountains. This covenant has to be periodically renewed through sacrifice, according to what is written here. The gathering felt waves of mute fear as the word sacrifices fell over them like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody was willing to accept what it was. Indicated, but there was unstoppable evidence. The book with names and dates, the burials in the cave, the dolls in the clearing, and the messages cut into the tree. Everything led to the same terrible end. Isaiah Hadley had somehow become involved in a series of ritual killings that had been occurring in the Appalachian Mountains for more than 40 years. However, how? Why? Isaiah was regarded as a decent father, a diligent worker, and a devout man. What could have led him to such a dark place? Thornton determined that they had to talk to the Hadleys' church reverend. Reverend Abel Morrison knew more than anybody else about Isaiah's spiritual difficulties. Morrison, who was 73 years old, had spent more than 30 years serving this small town. The Reverend gave Thornton and 2 deputies a look that was a mixture of sadness and what appeared to be remorse when they arrived at his humble wooden home close to the church. He said, "I've been waiting for you," and beckoned them inside. "I knew I would eventually have to share what I know with you." Morrison started talking while seated in the plain room, which was only dimly lit by candles. "About 2 months ago, Isaiah approached me. He was clearly upset, almost feverish. He claimed to have discovered something while hunting in the woods. Beneath a stone with odd symbols on it was an old artifact. You ought to have the book right now." "The book by Sarah Blackwood," Morrison added, his voice fading to a near whisper. That book was Isaiah's obsession. He was. Returned time and time again to inquire about Sarah Blackwood, her trial, and the events leading up to her execution. I shared my knowledge with him. In a nearby community, Sarah was charged with killing 6 children. They said that she had forged an alliance with ancient forces in order to acquire power, and that she carried out ceremonies in the mountains. She didn't dispute it when they caught her. She simply chuckled and remarked that others will come and carry on the deal she had inaugurated. The Reverend's hands were shaking as he reached for a drink of water. Isaiah questioned me about my belief in curses and whether someone might be bound by a deal made decades ago by someone else. I informed him that true faith safeguarded against such things and that they were superstitions. He wasn't persuaded, though. He said something that has plagued me ever since I last saw him 3 weeks ago. "Reverend, what if the covenant isn't something you choose? What if it chooses you? What if the—" Thornton felt a chill go down his spine as he said, "The only way to protect your family is to take someone else's place." Morrison nodded slowly. "Yes." And when I asked him what he meant, he simply shook his head and walked away. I never saw him again, and I never saw any of them again. The pieces started to fit together, creating a picture that none of the men in attendance wanted to accept. Isaiah had found the book. He had learned about the rituals and the pattern of disappearances, and somehow— "There's more," Morrison said, standing and making his way to a bookshelf. He took out a small wooden box and opened it, revealing letters, several of them in Isaiah's handwriting, that he had persuaded himself he was being called to carry on Sarah Blackwood's work. But why? What could lead a pious man with 7 children to feel he needed to perform human sacrifices? I believed them to be the ravings of a sick person, so I didn't reveal them to anyone. Man. However, I can now see that they were confessions. After accepting the letters, Thornton started reading them. Some of the paragraphs were frighteningly clear, yet the writing was muddled and occasionally incomprehensible. Isaiah wrote, "The voices in the mountains won't stop. They call to me every night. They say my family is marked, that the blood debt must be paid. They say if I don't obey, something worse will come for us all." He also wrote, "I have met the others who came before me." There, Isaiah's final letter, written 2 days before his disappearance, read, "Forgive me, Reverend. Forgive me, God, but I cannot let others suffer for my cowardice. If 9 souls are required, then let them be mine and the ones I love. At least then we control our destiny. At least then we won't be able to escape. Remains rest in the sacred chamber. Each tried to flee the call. Each failed. Now I understand there is no escape. Only the choice of when and how to fulfill the pact. Hunted like animals. I will take my family to the mountain when the moon changes phases again tomorrow night. When the stars are aligned, as the book indicates. We will do together what needs to be done, and maybe, just maybe, this will break the cycle forever." Thornton let the pages fall to the table, his hands shaking visibly, and the silence that followed the reading of that final letter was so thick it seemed to suck the air from the room. The truth was even more horrifying than any scenario they had imagined. Isaiah had not been. "We need to go back to that cave," Thornton said, standing suddenly. "Because if Isaiah took the family there 7 days ago, there might still be a chance we could find some survivors." The victim of an external attack, he had purposefully led his own family to their deaths in the hopes that doing so would somehow break an ancient curse. It's possible that Martha and the other young children have survived and are hiding somewhere on the mountain. However, Dr. Peaton grimaced as he gently shook his head. 7 days without food, Sheriff. The nights are getting below freezing in the mountains this time of year because there is no water. The odds of survival are low, even if someone had succeeded in getting away. Nevertheless, nobody wanted to give up in the absence of complete certainty. 12 men were swiftly assembled into a group. They prepared to spend the night on the mountain if needed by bringing ropes, flashlights, blankets, food, and water. Following the marks the men had left in the trees on the first excursion, they started out at twilight on that October 31st. The ascent was challenging in the dark, but nobody voiced any complaints. No matter how unlikely it was that anyone would be alive, every guy present felt the weight of urgency. Around 10 o'clock at night, they arrived at the rocky plateau. The stone circle was bathed in a spectral silvery light due to the full moon. The men could see that fresh ash had just been deposited, and the ash in the middle appeared to shine faintly in the light. Based on the quantity of burned remnants, it appears like someone started a big fire there a few days ago. They went up to the cave with weapons out, not sure what to anticipate. They could now discern footsteps in the loose ground surrounding the entrance, which was precisely how they had left it. Adult and child footprints of all sizes led into the cave, but none led out. With his headlamp creating swirling shadows on the wet walls, Thornton was the first to enter. The cave's atmosphere had changed. Everyone instantly recognized the sweet, cloying smell that had not been there before. It smelled like death. The team proceeded cautiously through They traveled via a little tunnel to the main chamber. Their greatest suspicions were confirmed by what they saw there. They had disassembled the 9 cans. The old bones had been carefully taken out and placed on the cave floor in a circle. 9 new corpses were positioned in the middle of this circle of old bones, which resembled the petals of a macabre flower. In the middle sat Isaiah Hadley, lying on his back with his eyes open, gazing at the cave ceiling as though he was thinking about something that only he could see. All around him, Martha and the 7 kids were dressed in spotless clothes and positioned with care, as though they were getting ready for a ritual. They were all dead, but not visibly hurt. They appeared to have just resolved to end their lives while lying there. Dr. Peaton used his flashlight to examine Isaiah's body as he crouched next to it. There are no wounds, no indications of violence, and no indications of a conflict. One by one, he examined the other bodies and discovered the same thing. They seemed to have been forced to sleep, perhaps poisoned by something that didn't show any symptoms. Isaiah held the book of Sarah Blackwood close to his chest. Thornton took it out carefully and opened it. There was a new page with Isaiah's handwriting on it. Written in new ink, the words were legible. I completed the vow. Sarah Blackwood started on October 29, 1834, during the full moon of the month of harvest. I voluntarily donated 9 souls to help the cycle come to an end, both my life and the lives of the people I care about the most. There was no discomfort. They slept soundly after I offered them tea made from the herbs mentioned in the book. I then had the same drink. Know that I took the proper action if you are reading this. I have no soul, so may God have mercy on it. There was a little, empty glass vial with dark residue at the bottom next to the book. Peanut took a careful whiff. Belladonna most likely combined with other herbs. When taken in excess, it induces respiratory stoppage and deep sleep. They were not physically harmed, at least. Miller, Joshua, who had stayed close to the door of the chamber, yelled out to the others, "There's something else here. Look at the walls." The paintings they had seen before were different. New markings had been added. Isaiah had drawn 9 new figures, all holding hands, in a circle around the ancient symbols. The men took the bodies out of the cave with profound reverence, and over them was written in enormous letters, "Let this be the last sacrifice." Despite being aware of what Isaiah had done, as they carried the tiny body of 5-year-old Hannah, who would never have the opportunity to mature, get married, or start a family of her own, it was impossible not to feel profound sadness. Each child stood for a future that had been robbed not by a vicious murderer, but by a parent who was driven by dark ideas and unreasonable fears. It took all night to get down from the mountain. On November 1st, they reached the Hadley property just as the sun was rising. There were already other men and women from the neighborhood waiting for news. A collective wail emerged from the crowd as they saw the dead, wrapped in blankets, being brought in one by one. Mothers shed tears for Martha and the kids. Men averted their eyes, unable to comprehend how such a thing could have occurred in their tranquil neighborhood. 3 days later, Reverend Morrison conducted a modest funeral service. In the little graveyard of the church, the 9 coffins were interred side by side. The question of whether Isaiah should be buried on the designated sanctified ground was hotly debated. What he'd done. Morrison countered that Isaiah had been both a victim and a culprit, overwhelmed by something he could neither comprehend nor fight, and that no man was above God's mercy. The news of what had occurred quickly circulated throughout Virginia. The so-called mountain tragedy was covered by newspapers from Richmond, Charleston, and even farther afield. Even when some reporters attempted to conduct interviews at Greenbrier, they encountered opposition. The neighborhood desired to. I forgot to bury the story with the bodies, but it wasn't possible to bury everything. Sheriff Thornton was plagued with questions. Was the cycle really stopped if Isaiah had fulfilled his end of the bargain? Or might more people discover that cursed book later on and experience the same obsessions? Above all, what had initially prompted Sarah Blackwood to initiate it? What had occurred to her to make her capable of producing something so terrible? Thornton, sheriff, determined that he had to find answers to those questions. He felt a responsibility to the 9 lost lives, but the community wanted to move on. To be sure this evil was truly over, he had to know where it came from. He spent all of the days after the funeral researching Sarah Blackwood's narrative, searching through old documents that had been kept in forgotten trunks and dirty basements. His expectations were drastically altered by what he found. Initially, Sarah Blackwood had not been a dark figure who was committed to macabre rites. She had been a well-known healer and midwife who assisted women in the area during challenging deliveries. She was born in 1762, and her mother, who had learnt from her grandmother, taught her how to do it. There have been healers in the Blackwood family for many generations. In 1791, everything changed. According to documents Thornton discovered, the small town where Sarah resided experienced an unexplained disease that year. It began with the kids. Elevated fevers, convulsions, and delirium. Sarah experimented with every remedy and plant she was aware of. However, over the period of 3 months, 6 children passed away one by one. Sarah says 2 kids, a 6-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy, were among them. Grief-stricken and in need of solutions, the community started to murmur that Sarah was to blame. She had, after all, cared for every child that passed away. Her herbs might have been toxic. Maybe she was trying something new. The charges grew until 1792, when Sarah was officially accused of murder and witchcraft. Witnesses claimed to have observed her engaging in bizarre rituals, talking to the woods, and strolling alone in the highlands at night throughout the brief 2-day trial. As Thornton read the papers, she came to the conclusion that grieving had been her only true crime. By connecting with nature and using age-old prayers her grandmother had given her, she was processing the loss of her own children in the best way she knew how. However, in a terrified community searching for someone to blame, this was sufficient to persuade her. Thornton discovered the distressing story of a witness who had witnessed the execution. On March 15, 1797, Sarah was taken to the gallows. She didn't weep or ask for forgiveness. As the executioner repositioned the rope around her neck, she stood quietly. However, she spoke just before the platform collapsed. The clear recorded her final words. "You call it justice when you murder an innocent person. Let the mountains be reminded of this injustice then. Let the cost of the blood be borne by each generation. Today, you spilled. By the pained souls of those who see, not by my hand, for I shall die. Their curse will be the burden of guilt. It was not a covenant with evil powers. It was a curse brought on by injustice and hopelessness." Sarah had not initiated a custom of selflessness. She had spoken like a broken lady who had lost her reputation, her life, and her children. However, the superstition and terror that characterized those mountains had given rise to those phrases. Thornton came to. Something important. All of the individuals on the books list were either direct descendants of the people who condemned Sarah or members of the community. The trial's presiding judge's daughter was Elizabeth Warren. The man who had initially implicated Sarah in public was Jonathan Pierce's grandson. One of the important witness's nieces was Mary Sullivan, and his great-grandfather, Isaiah Hadley, had been the one who put Sarah Blackwood to death. Thornton felt the realization hit him like a blast of cold water. There wasn't. Archaic custom, no supernatural being requesting offerings. All that was present was the oppressive burden of shame that had been passed down through the ages. Each member on the list had discovered, in one way or another, how they were connected to Sarah's injustice. And that information, along with the book Sarah had saved, the rumors going about, and the terror of the isolated mountains, had been sufficient to wipe them off. After discovering the book, Thaya learned that his great-grandfather had put an innocent woman to death. He had. Study up on the alleged curse. In his tortured mind, he had deduced that the only way to save his family from the doom he felt was predetermined was to carry out what he considered to be an agreement after observing the pattern of murders and disappearances. However, it had all been a delusion, a tragedy brought on by fear, remorse, and a warped perception of the past. Sitting in his office amid piles of old papers, Thornton experienced a profound sense of exhaustion. Isaiah had murdered his whole family in an attempt to end a curse that didn't exist. After learning of their link to Sarah Blackwood's demise, the other individuals on the list most likely experienced similar outcomes, overwhelmed by paranoia and sadness. However, a question continued to bother him. How did each of these individuals find out about the book? How had they all been guided to that cave, that rocky plateau? All of these incidents over the years had to be connected by something deeper, some unseen thread. He recalled something Reverend Morrison had said at that point. Isaiah had claimed to have discovered the book hidden beneath a designated stone. How, though, had he known where to look? Thornton returned to the letters Isaiah had sent to the Reverend and took a closer look at them. He had already missed a line in one of them. The elderly man directed me to the book's location. He added that since he had been there before me, it was now my job to bear the load. Which elderly man? His name was never mentioned by Isaiah. Thornton started looking into the elderly local neighbors who might have interacted with Isaiah. Days later, one name kept coming up in the interviews. Ezekiel Marsh was a recluse who lived high in the mountains and hardly visited society. He was in his 80s, or even his 90s, according to the few people who knew him. His origins and the date of his arrival were unknown. Thornton set out to locate Ezekiel Marsh. Since no one knew the elderly man's actual residence, he brought 4 men and enough food for several days. Hunters occasionally reported seeing smoke rising from an area, and they followed their hazy reports. Solitary cabin north of the rocky plateau in a secluded valley. After 3 days of looking, they eventually located the cabin. Using the natural rock as one of the walls, it was a crude building that was partially carved into the side of a cliff. Lazily, smoke wafted from the stone chimney. Thornton walked slowly up to the rough wooden door and knocked. The old hinges of the door creaked as it slowly opened. In the opening, a very old man emerged. Ezekiel Marsh was so hunched over that he could hardly. The shoulder of Thornton. His eyes were remarkably sharp and awake, watching the guests with a penetrating intelligence that belied the weakness of his frame, despite the fact that his skin was like tanned leather from years of exposure to the sun and mountain wind. "I've been waiting for you," Ezekiel said, his voice but firm. "It took longer than I thought. I figured you'd come right after finding the Hadleys." He stepped away from the door, gesturing for them to enter. "Come in. I'm drinking hot tea and can respond to any inquiries you may have." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly well organized. The walls were lined with shelves that held jars of dried roots, herbs, and other items that Thornton was unable to identify. There were many books piled high. Some of them were so ancient that their covers were crumbling. A wooden table with mismatched seats sat in the middle of the one room. Ezekiel waited for the men to ask their inquiries while filling pewter mugs with tea. Thornton started, "Still knew Isaiah Hadley." It wasn't a query. Ezekiel gave a slow nod. I followed in the footsteps of the 17 people I knew before him over a long period of time. I discovered them all in the same manner, led them all to the same fate. His eyes were far away, lost in recollections as he sipped his tea. With a stern voice, Thornton remarked, "I guess you want to know why. You want to understand what seems incomprehensible. You led them to their deaths. You deliberately led these people to that cave, gave them the book, planted ideas of curses and pacts in their minds. Of monster would do that." The charge didn't appear to anger Ezekiel. He simply let out a sigh, a tired voice that carried decades' worth of weight. "Monster. That's a suitable word, I guess. But let me tell you my story before you pass judgment. After that, you can choose how to handle me." He got up with difficulty and made his way to a wooden box in the hut's corner. He opened it and took out a cloth-wrapped object. He unfolded it on the table and saw an aged silver medallion. Within was a small portrait of a young woman with nice eyes and black hair. Ezekiel said, "Sarah Blackwood," his voice cracking for the first time. "When my sister was put to death, I was 15 years old. I witnessed everything. I witnessed the throng yelling for her blood. I witnessed the judge disregard all of the proof that she was innocent. While those who were really guilty, those who twisted grief into accusation and fear into murder, went free. I witnessed the executioner adjusting the rope and my sister dying for a crime she did not commit." He was cautious. Holding the locket close to his chest, he closed it. "I was simply a scared boy back then. There was nothing I could do to save her. But while her body dangled from that rope, I vowed that justice would be served eventually, a deeper, more enduring justice, not the justice of the courts that had failed so utterly." Ezekiel returned to his seat, his gaze now focused on Thornton. "I studied and learned for years. I visited remote locations and talked to folks who had knowledge of the human mind and how shame may be a stronger force than any weapon. Moreover, after that, I went back to these mountains and started working." Ezekiel went on, "Sarah's book wasn't originally about rituals or pacts. It was nothing more than a healer's journal, herbal remedies, and age-old prayers that our grandma had taught her. But I added pages when Sarah passed away. I wrote about curses and sacrifices, developed rites, and made symbols. I used a harmless book as a psychological tool. After that, I buried the book where I knew it would be discovered." Thornton's stomach began to grow queasy. "You created for decades a complex trap. What comes next? You looked for the offspring of those who murdered your sister. I didn't need to search very far. I just had to wait until someone from the right family started asking questions about the past, and then I would show up, a harmless old hermit, and casually mention that I knew old stories about," Ezekiel remarked. Guilt has a way of perpetuating itself through generations. Children hear stories from their parents. Grandchildren find old letters. Family secrets come to light. The human mind is remarkable in its ability to find patterns even where none exist. They read about the supposed curse, learned about their family's connection to Sarah Blackwood's death, and started to notice coincidences in their lives. An illness, an accident, a financial larceny. Common misfortune became evidence of the curse in action. Ezekiel picked up his. "I didn't kill these people, Sheriff. They killed themselves, consumed by inherited guilt and irrational fear. I merely provided the fuel. They lit the fire." "This isn't justice," Thornton said, his voice trembling with repressed rage. "It's psychological torture. It's indirect murder. 7 children in the Hadley family died who had nothing to do with what happened to their sister 40 years ago." "No, Ezekiel." Calmly, he acknowledged, "It's not justice. I realized that a long time ago. But it's not easy to just stop when you spend decades harboring hatred, building an elaborate vendetta. It becomes who you are, your reason for being." When he finally turned to face Thornton, tears welled up in his old eyes. "I was devastated by every fatality, particularly the kids. However, I persuaded myself that it was essential, that the guilty families had to pay the price, just as my sister had to pay for a crime she did not commit. Make a commitment." "Even Isaiah," Ezekiel added, his voice hardly audible anymore. "I read the letters he sent to the Reverend. I shouldn't have had access to them, but I have my forms. When I read his final letter, I realized that he intended to sacrifice not only himself, but his entire family, including little Hannah, who was only 5 years old. I saw something different in him when I first met him. He was genuinely good and devout, and he battled obsession more than anyone else." Ezekiel trailed off, unable to. "Continue for a moment." "The night Isaiah organized the ceremony, I walked up to that cave." Ezekiel eventually stated, "I arrived late, but still in time to see them. Each of them has already consumed the poison. It was their final sleep as they lay in that circle. Isaiah was hardly awake." Ezekiel put the mug on the table and stated, "The cycle was finally broken, and no other family would suffer." He grinned at me, as if I were some sort of divine herald, confirming he had done the right thing. Sarah would have been appalled. She had devoted her life to saving children, and I had spent decades fabricating circumstances that resulted in the deaths of innocent children, betraying everything she stood for in the name of a retaliation she would never have desired. The cabin was completely silent, broken only by trembling hands. I stood there as he died, watching each child's breathing slow until it stopped completely. And it was in that moment, surrounded by 9 innocent bodies, that I finally understood the monster I had become. The crackling of the fire in the grate. The men who accompanied Thornton stared at Ezekiel with a mixture of horror and something close to involuntary compassion. Here was a man who had devoted his entire life to a vengeance that ultimately consumed not only his victims, but also his own humanity. At last Thornton spoke, his voice controlled but full of emotion. "You must answer for this. No matter how tortured your story, no matter what injustice you suffered, 17 people died, including innocent children. You will be." Ezekiel nodded slowly, as though he had anticipated it. "Taken to Lewisburg, tried, and probably hanged, just as your sister was." He struggled to his feet. "I won't resist. In fact, I feel a strange relief at finally being found out. Yes, I suppose it's fitting, a sort of circle closing. The brother was executed for murders he orchestrated through psychological manipulation, and the sister was executed for witchcraft she didn't practice. There's a poetic symmetry to it." Ezekiel went back to the wooden chest and took out several volumes. "I've made copies over the years. I always needed to have a new one ready for the next victim. These are the last 3. You can destroy them or keep them as evidence. It doesn't matter anymore." Thornton picked up the books and leafed through them. Thornton had more questions than I had anticipated. "The book. Where is the original now? Isaiah had a copy in the cave, but are there others?" "Works. each appearing truly ancient because of the methods Ezekiel had used to age the paper and ink. "You are a skilled craftsman as well as a manipulator," Thornton said bitterly. "How long did it take to create each of these?" Ezekiel replied. "Each book had to feel authentic, had to carry the weight of history. The symbols had to be complex enough to seem mystical, but not so obscure that they couldn't be interpreted. The instructions for the supposed rituals had to be detailed, but it was a life's work in a way," Ezekiel said, looking out the small window of the cabin at the mountains stretching in every direction. "What if we hadn't found out? If Isaiah hadn't left those letters for the Reverend? If we'd never connected you to this, how many other families would have been destroyed?" It was unclear, allowing each person to interpret them through the lens of their own fears and guilt. Ezekiel turned to face Thornton and continued, "There was, however, one thing I haven't told you yet. Isaiah was the last direct descendant I could find, and after him, the project would be finished. 17 souls to pay for the 6 children who died of the disease, for Sarah's death, for the years of suffering our family endured. It's cruel math, I admit, and it doesn't really make sense, but it was the logic I had built in my mind over the years." He went back to the chest and, this time, took out a yellowed envelope that I had discovered 5 years ago, tucked away between the floorboards of the old house where Sarah lived before she was put to death. The house had been abandoned for decades and had fallen into disrepair, so I went there one last time before it completely collapsed, looking for any reminder of my sister. Thornton took the envelope and carefully opened it, finding a letter in Sarah's handwriting and starting to read it. "To whoever finds this, if anyone finds it, my name is Sarah Blackwood, and I will be dead by the time these words are read. I was found guilty of crimes I didn't commit. I was accused of killing children I desperately tried to save. I didn't know the disease that took them. I died a little with each child, especially with my own children." The letter went on. "I know I will be executed. I know there is no hope of clemency from this community that has turned grief into hatred and fear into accusation. When they accompany me to the gallows, I will have 2 options. Either I die in silence, keeping my dignity intact, or I curse them, uttering words of vengeance that will haunt their consciences. I'm not sure which option I'll choose, but if I go with the curse, I leave this on record now while I'm still in my right mind. Let it be just words. I have no control over the future." The letter concluded with a request. "May God bless those who cursed me, for they know not what they do. If I have a brother still alive, Ezekiel, who was 15 when I was arrested, I hope he doesn't carry hatred in his heart. I hope he finds peace, that he builds a life beyond this tragedy. I don't want revenge. I just want to be remembered as I was, a healer who tried to help, a mother who loved her children, a woman who didn't deserve this fate." "She asked me not to seek revenge," he continued, his voice shaking, looking up at Ezekiel, an elderly man with tears running down his creased face. "And I spent 40 years doing just that," he said. "I disregarded her final request. I compromised her recollection. I violated all of her principles. And for what purpose? Her murderers passed away from natural causes long ago." He seemed to shrink even more as he dropped back into his chair, saying, "The ones I killed were merely descendants who bore no guilt for their ancestors' crimes. I should have stopped, burned the remaining books, and let the retaliation die when I discovered this letter 5 years ago. But my hatred had consumed me so thoroughly that I was unable to do so. I told myself that Sarah had written it in a moment of weakness, and that she genuinely wanted justice, but I knew deep down that I was lying to myself." Robert Hayes looked at Thornton. "What do we do with him now, Sheriff?" Thornton sighed. He looked at Ezekiel and asked, Are you prepared to face that? Ezekiel replied, Yes, more than ready. In fact, I think it's the only way I can finally find some peace. Sarah faced her execution with dignity, even though she was innocent. The least I can do is face mine while guilty. He stood and held out his wrists, saying, You can handcuff me if you think necessary. Thornton chose not to handcuff the man, who was over 80 years old and barely able to walk. He wasn't a flight risk, but before they left he needed to be certain of one thing. Is there something else we should know? Some other hidden truth? Some other horror we haven't yet uncovered? Ezekiel thought for a long time. Just this. Destroy that cave. Seal the entrance. These mountains have been my home and my prison for far too long. Don't let it become a monument to insanity. The journey back to Lewisburg took 2 full days. Ezekiel Marsh walked slowly, leaning on a staff Thornton had permitted him to bring. The old man spoke little, lost during the journey. It's not just because of what happened there, but because places like that harbor darkness not in the supernatural sense, but in the human sense. They become places where tragedies are remembered, where troubled people can go to find inspiration for their own obsessions. Ezekiel Marsh's trial started 3 weeks later, in early December 1834, and the courtroom was packed every day. People came from neighboring counties, some walking for days just to witness this historic moment. The prosecutor painstakingly presented the evidence, and when they finally arrived in the town, a crowd had already gathered. News spread quickly, and everyone wanted to see the man responsible for the tragedy that had shocked the entire region. The defense claimed that Ezekiel was insane, and that his ability to reason clearly had been destroyed by 40 years of living alone in the mountains, harboring hatred for the injustice suffered by his sister. Doctors were called to testify about his mental state, and some agreed that there were signs of his insanity. Other witnesses included Sheriff Thornton's testimony regarding the confession, Isaiah's letters demonstrating how he had been manipulated, and the testimonies of people who had witnessed Ezekiel speaking to other victims over the years. Of pathological obsession. Others contended that Ezekiel was perfectly lucid, that he had planned and carried out his manipulations with a clarity of purpose that demonstrated sanity, even if morally distorted. Ezekiel himself rejected the defense of insanity, and when he was given the opportunity to speak in court, he rose with difficulty and firmly addressed the jury, saying, "I am not insane. I was consumed by hatred and a desire for revenge, but I always knew exactly what I was doing. Every step was calculated. Every manipulation was planned. I cannot and will not hide behind insanity, please." He looked around the crowded courtroom, sweeping his gaze over the families of the victims in attendance. "I do not ask for forgiveness, for I know I do not deserve it. I do not ask for mercy, for I have shown none. I only ask that my story serve as a warning. 17 people died as a result of the seeds I planted in their minds. Their deaths weigh on my conscience, and they should weigh on my sentence." After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that was expected, but still caused a collective gasp in the courtroom. Guilty of first-degree murder, 17 counts. Injustice breeds injustice. Revenge brings no peace, only perpetuates cycles of pain. My sister Sarah was innocent and was executed. I tried to avenge her death and ended up causing the deaths of more innocent people. Do not let my existence be completely in vain. In his cell that night, Ezekiel was visited by Reverend Morrison, who had come from Greenbrier specifically to see him. The two men spoke for hours, Morrison not to condemn, but to try to understand how a human being could lose themselves so completely to darkness. He was a wise man with a reputation for severity, but he also said that the sentence would be handed down the next day. Ezekiel talked about his childhood with Sarah, how devoted and kind she was, had been, of how witnessing her execution had shattered a basic part of him. "I spent so much time focused on revenge that I forgot how to live," Ezekiel admitted to the Reverend. "I forgot joy. Love, I forgot." Human connection slipped my mind. All I had left was the purpose, the plan, and after each victim passed away, I felt nothing but emptiness rather than satisfaction. However, I was too far gone to turn back now. It resembled plummeting off a precipice. You cannot simply decide to give up midway. Morrison listened. The Reverend took his old hands after Ezekiel finished and said, "No soul is beyond redemption. What you did was terrible, unforgivable in the eyes of many. But if there is genuine repentance, if there is true acknowledgement of the harm done, then there is hope for peace, even if it comes only in the final moments." That night they prayed together, two figures bent with age and the weight of various burdens. Judge Mitchell sentenced Ezekiel Marsh the following day, convicted of 17 killings. Even if you used unconventional tactics planting seeds of psychological devastation instead of actual weapons, the outcome was the same. Among the 17 fatalities were defenseless youngsters who were deprived of the opportunity to life. The penalties for these offenses are explicit in the law. He stopped and gave Ezekiel a direct look. "Until you die, you will be hanged by the neck. I pray that God will save your soul." 1 week prior to Christmas, on December 22nd, the execution was set to take place. It wasn't at random. Date selection, but it had symbolic significance and served as a sobering reminder that justice must be done even during happy and hopeful times. Ezekiel maintained his composure in the days preceding the execution. Reverend Morrison, who continued to provide spiritual consolation, was one of the few visitors he received. A throng much bigger than the one at the trial gathered in Lewisburg's Center Plaza on the morning of the execution. Yes, there was morbid interest, but there was also a need to see that justice had been served, acted on behalf of the victims. Slowly but steadily, Ezekiel was taken to the gallows. The hood that is often given to the condemned he declined. He stated he wanted to see paradise one final time. Ezekiel nodded when asked if he had any final remarks. Despite his advanced age, his speech was clear. "My sister Sarah was executed here 43 years ago for crimes she did not commit. I am hanging today for crimes that I did, in fact, commit. I understand the irony, but there is a significant distinction. Sarah died resentful of those who convicted her while being innocent. I fully comprehend what she attempted to convey in her final letter. Therefore, I die guilty, but at peace." He peered over the throng. The dead are not honored by revenge. What was lost is not restored by it. It just results in more suffering, death, and destroyed lives. Let this be the lesson my narrative imparts. Let the people who started the injustice die with their hatred. Don't let the next generation inherit it. End the cycle. Don't do the same thing I did. The rope around Ezekiel's neck was adjusted by the executioner. The elderly man muttered something that sounded like a prayer as he closed his eyes. Ezekiel Marsh then paid the ultimate pay for his deeds as the platform collapsed. They claimed that he didn't suffer for very long, maybe not much comfort, but more than many of his victims were given. Sheriff Thornton granted Ezekiel's last wish in the weeks that followed. He assembled a party of soldiers and went back to the mountain's stony plateau. They totally covered the cave entrance with tons of rock after sealing it with gunpowder and heavy tools. After that, they took the stones out of the ceremonial circle and tossed them down the cliff, dispersing them so they could never be put back together. All tangible remnants of that tragic location were destroyed. The original book by Sarah Blackwood and the copies made by Ezekiel were burned in public in the town center of Lewisburg. The sheriff wanted to be positive that there would be no evidence of their manipulations. Endure in order to possibly trick another distressed person later on. It was believed that the ashes would be the final tangible reminder of that terrible past. However, memories are more difficult to destroy. Over the years, the Hadley family and Ezekiel Marsh's story has been recounted numerous times in the Appalachian mountain towns. It has turned into a sinister folklore, a warning about the perils of unresolved animosity, of retaliation that consumes generations, and of how trauma can become tragedy if not handled appropriately. The Hadley family's 9 members are interred in a modest cemetery which has evolved into a serene space for introspection. Travelers occasionally pause in the area to look at the 9 headstones side by side and reflect on the frailty of human sanity, the burden of hereditary guilt, and how readily terror can be used as a weapon by those who know how it works. The Hadley property was left unoccupied for many years. When the house finally fell, it was taken back by the forest that had been there forever, waiting to take back that area of land. The foundation's remnants can still be found today if you know where to look. Moss and vine-covered stones. A somber tribute to a family destroyed by the most human of all failings, not by otherworldly powers. Because we seek explanations for the unexplainable, we have the capacity to believe that our concerns are true, and thus concludes the most unsettling tale of injustice, retaliation, and, in the shadowy mountains of West Virginia, decades of deceit and tragedy took place. There are only sobering lessons about the price of hatred and the necessity of halting painful cycles before they devour all in their path. There is no happy ending or total redemption in this story. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more tales from the forgotten. If this story moved you in any way or caused you to consider the shadows we bear and the legacies we decide to continue or leave behind. The depths of American history. Post your opinions and personal family tales of long-forgotten secrets and incidents in the comments. And never forget that all truth eventually comes to light, even while mountains remain mysterious for eons.